Thanks a lot. Thanks everyone. Nice to be here after an hour's gridlock on the M6. It's good to be on the ground again. I'll just explain a little bit about. Thank you for the wonderful introduction. But I'll just explain a little bit more about what I do as well, because I think that helps with what I'm going to talk about. So, as you can see, the title of the seminar today is Gardening as a Creative Practice. I've been involved in creativity theory and creative practices for about 15, 20 years now, and that's my day job, and particularly within education, primary school, secondary school, and so on. As a sideline, I've sort of become more and more madly in love with gardening, and I've started to sort of meld the two together. So that's a bit of what I'm going to talk about today, and so it's mostly from personal experience, but also with chats with other colleagues as well through the last 4 or 5 years of my journey in being a plant collection holder. So just to give you a bit of context about Mintopia, which is the name I came up with for the sales of the plants, to be honest, and as a sort of public-facing website for the collection itself. I needed to sell plants because it costs quite a bit, as I'm sure you know here if you've got 3. It costs quite a bit, the upkeep of plants, especially if you've got 187 different varieties of mint. I mean, thankfully, they're quite tolerant of neglect, as you'll know. But that's an important factor. I'll come to that again in a minute as well. So I set it up as a website where I could sell them. This is a bit of shameless self-promotion, obviously. But the important thing to mention, though, is that I decided to group them according to collection, not by species or anything to do with form or variants or anything like that. I grouped them by their utility. So, for example, you could get an individual plant, no problem. But if you wanted to have a plant that was specific to drinking as a beverage, that's further broke down into 2 different collections. So you can have the tea collection or the tipple collection. So, because of course mints are really used in cocktails quite a lot. And there are specific mints for specific cocktails. And in the same way, there are specific mints for various cuisines as well, and mint is used all over the world, as you'll know, in all sorts of different cuisine. But usually there's a very particular mint that goes with the particular dish. And then finally, the last set of collections that I decided to group together were, what did I call it now? I think it was the Explorers Collection. So they're mints from all over the world, different far-flung places, and then a floral collection as well for those people who really are just interested more in the aesthetics and what you can do in a garden with mints. So that kind of collection, the floral one, would have things like the Buddleia mint, really tall, massive big terminal spikes, great for pollinators, and also the Corsican mint, which is over here, Menthology, which is a great crazy little ground covering spreader, which I absolutely adore. I don't know if you can see that in the camera, just because of its scent actually more than anything, and it's great to put between cobbles and paving. So do you want me to? I was going to say, that's a good idea, isn't it? So go on then. Yeah, so have a little sniff as we go. That's fantastic. So that's how I set it up. And to my surprise, it was a really popular way of getting people interested in plants, because a lot of the time, what I was finding, people didn't know what they were after. They just knew they wanted a mint because they liked drinking mint tea, but didn't know what kind of mint to go to or what the species was. So it's in a sense, a kind of populist approach to getting people into different species and hopefully maintaining biodiversity, which is, of course, the key kind of principle of the national collections. So just as a little close-up there, you can see that's just, if you click on one of those tiles that I just showed you, it just takes you through to a page where you can see the types of mints that are available in the different collections. So just in the Cuppa collection, for example, there's quite a few there, and there's a lot more as well, by the way. This is just indicative of the kind of mints that you might want to choose. So, for example, I've not even got Atlas Mountain mint on there, which is a really, really popular drink in sort of the Al Maghreb region of Morocco. It's a sort of furry kind of Sauve Leones type. It's lovely. So, right, less of the commercial side. So when I started it, it just blew out of all proportion, like way more than I ever expected to sort of happen, really. But I think the reason for it stems from why it started, why the collection actually started. So I'm going to sort of explain now what happened, but it's not a sob story, and I don't mean to get the violins out or anything like that. It's just that it's a thing that I journeyed through, and I think it's worth sharing. So that's what I do. And that's why all these people, I think, were interested in it too, because there was something in there that I think touches people's understanding of what gardening is as well. So basically, about 4 years ago, I lost my dad. Really quick thing. It was about 6 months, and it was really, it was a shock. And I've always been interested in gardening. I've been a chef, a landscaper, and all sorts of things in the past, which have all led me into this kind of, deeper want to be in the garden. But what I found after my dad died is I was spending more and more time in the garden. And it really, I didn't notice it at first, didn't think about it. I just took it as an opportunity to reflect, a quiet time to think about what had happened, to process, and to sort of, that's I guess my way, it was my way of grieving, I guess. And one day, I was sat on the bench and having a cup of tea, surveying the estate, not an estate, the garden, small garden, and I was sort of patting myself on the back a bit, really, because I was feeling good about what I did, about my garden. I was just looking at it. I was looking at the different species, thinking how great it was because I knew some Latin, and then I thought, oh, this is actually really a superficial knowledge. I don't really have any depth of knowledge here. It's really, just the surface level. So I challenged myself. I said, right, okay, I'm going to choose a species or a genus or something, and I'm going to find out as much as I can about it. Now, my garden at home is a sort of potage style garden, so it's all about utility, it's about functionality, as much as flowers and colour and that as well. I do love form, all that sort of stuff too, but it means that whatever I chose to really look deeply into had to fit into that kind of, that kind of idea of what a garden is. So I chose mint, as I said before, partly because it tolerates neglect, but also because it's so functional, and that really drew me to it. So after about a year, I'd got about, not many, maybe about 12 plants, but I was one of the first ones I found. I don't know if you'll get the oils out of this one, but this is banana mint. I don't know if you've come across it before. It's been rubbed a lot, this one, because I had an event over the weekend, so a lot of its oils have gone already, I think, but oh no, it's coming back. So that's banana. When I first smelt that, I was just absolutely blown away. I just couldn't believe that there was a mint that smelt like banana. It was the strangest thing. That one's strawberry mint. Should I pass it that way? Have a little sniff on that one as well. Again, I just couldn't believe it. This really got me going then. I thought, wow, this is really interesting. So after about 2 or 3 years, I had 50. And then in the 4th year, I had 187 different types. I've still got 30 sitting over in the States that I'm desperately trying to work out with DEFRA and stuff to get them over here as well. But there's also quite stringent copyright and patents in the States too, so it's a bit of a difficulty, but I'm going to do it. So I'm sat there, as I say, and I had this sort of decision, and I made this decision I was going to collect more and more. And then over time, I started to think about what all this meant. Like, what's going on here? Like, why am I doing this? It's a bit of a strange thing to suddenly just do. I mean, I do like gardening, but I realised that collecting was something important. I must actually give credit to a chap called Sam Vale, who I had a chat with, who's at Coventry Uni, actually. He was at Canterbury when I first chatted to him. But Sam collects collectors. And he got in touch with me during COVID and asked, and bought some mints off me. And when we got chatting, we had a mint tea over Teams or Zoom. And without really divulging why I'd started collecting, he said to me, having spoken to nearly 40 or 50 collectors over time, he said a large majority of them, when they started collecting, had had a close bereavement, like family bereavement. They'd gone through some kind of grief. And this was just, this was like a bombshell. I was like, no way, that's it. That's why I'm doing it. I hadn't realised. And it was something about taking back a bit of control, about organising my life again, trying to order it in a way that where I had some agency, you know, in all the chaos and the madness of what had happened. So it was a really, really interesting thing to just, when he said that, I can't even begin to explain really the depth of shock. I was like, what, you know, whoa, this is incredible. So I think there's something about collecting alongside gardening. Now I think, I mentioned it in a later slide. I actually think it's got something to do with biophilia, which I'm sure you're aware of. It was a term coined by E.O. Wilson, I think in 1984. And it's really bio, life, philia, love, simple as that. It's just that as a species, the hypothesis suggests that we need to be near other species. And I think that the more species we're next to, the better we feel. I think over time, that original hypothesis has actually been proven now by a fairly wide array of different research that's been undertaken. So I started then to apply the idea of what gardening was and collecting, to what creative practices were. So that's my academic background in a way. So there's certain things that I could sense it. I mean, there's the obvious thing, you know, you design a garden, you think about the form, the texture, the colour, and so on. So you can connect it to, say, the visual arts quite readily. I actually think gardening's a bit more like music, because I think the sort of the biorhythms and tempos also have this kind of more ethereal element that you can play with. But there are other things as well that really do connect. And I will come back to those in a minute. I'm just going to check that I've not moved on a slide too fast. No, that's fine. The other so I start doing a bit of research into, like, you know, what is gardening? Is it an art? Is it a craft? What is it? How do we view it? Came across a really interesting article, I think it was in The Guardian in 2010 by Summerlee, and she describes how gardening in the last 20 or 30 years has started to become more, there's been a bit more of a critical discourse on what good gardening is, or, you know, artful gardening. But I think from what she was saying, it would be fair to surmise that there's a really old tension that seems to have risen up within the gardening world between, and it's this tension that I call here hierarchical tension between craft and art. You see it all the time in other disciplines, you know, where conceptual art is viewed as more prestigious than, say, I don't know, yarn bombing or cross stitch. You know, well, actually, from a creative practice point of view, there's not really a great deal of difference, in the sense that they revolve around certain ideas, like reflexive practice, sustained approach, a kind of a reflective approach as well. That's what makes a creative practice. And so that, for that reason, I do think that gardening is a creative practice, because it seems to tick all the boxes that, you know, you'd normally associate with a creative practice. What worried me, though, is that there is this hierarchical tension that seems to be appearing in sort of gardening discourses now. I think the other thing that was quite interesting to me as I was doing this kind of research to sort of get the context for what I was interested in, this well, really gardening as a creative practice, but also as a well-being thing. There was loads of institutions all around the country, whether it's the RHS or BBC, there's a reference there. Loads of these large institutions and organisations will really have massive well-being drives at the moment to, you know, to say that gardening is good for you. You know, and again, I do think it links to biophilia, but I think there's also a need at the moment, with everything that's happened in the world over the last sort of 5 or 6 years. Well, you know, this well-being crisis, as people call it, I think there is a need to sort of understand how we can help ourselves a little bit more. So it's great that these institutions are looking for those solutions. This was a wonderful thing. I don't know if any of you have seen it, but the BBC Studios Natural History Unit got teamed up with some artists, and they produced some really interesting work. So again, it was this kind of, you know, the creative arts and gardening mixing really quite seamlessly, actually, to produce some really interesting work. Mike Gunson said there are using creative ways of using nature's creativity to be creative. So I've already mentioned a few of these, really. So if we're going to think of gardening as a creative practice, so we can understand how it is good for our well-being, these are the sorts of things that I would pull out of creativity theory and creative practice theory as things that are also apparent in gardening. So, for example, a reflexive approach. You need to be constantly thinking about where you've put some, you know, so if a plant starts looking a bit bit flop. You notice, you think, no, I need to move that, it's not working. There's a necessary degree of criticality therefore, because you're constantly having to think, oh right, okay, what's that bed going to be? Where's the sun? It's all, it's not as simple as just putting in a plant, especially when it comes to design elements as well, just to try and make things aesthetic as well. It's a sustained practice, without question. It's something you have to keep on keeping on. It's not, a garden's never finished really, is it? So I think that's a really interesting aspect actually, because it does differ from a lot of creative practices in that there's a drive in the current world that we live in to have products and to have this finished thing, where actually most creativity theory is more interested in process rather than the final product. And again, I think gardening fits that really nicely because it's ongoing. It doesn't, it's a thing that we live with and alongside. This is an interesting one, an element of social validation. So there's been quite a lot of creativity studies, theories and models proposed over the years. And Cropley is one that's really stood the test of time. It's actually an article called, I think it's is it 7 or 5? I forget now. 7-stage model of creativity. The last stage, of which, whether it's 5 or 7, is social validation. And it's this idea that we need to feel that we've done something that's worthwhile and for other people to validate it. It's a tricky one, that, I'll give you, because I think, personally, I'm of the view that if you just doodle on a piece of paper, there's a creativity in there. But for Cropley at least, it's not really a creative act unless it's been passed on and someone else has looked at it and gone, oh, that's good, and then you get this validation. And I think any garden is like that. Whether we admit it or not, there's often a pride in our gardens, and when someone comes and visits us, we want them to go, oh, this is beautiful, this is amazing, and that's the social validation aspect, I think. Risk-taking, a massive one in the creative arts and creative practices and cultural education, something that's actually at risk itself, strangely. I won't get into all the politics of that now, but it's certainly a big thing. And again, I think when gardening, that's something that we do naturally, because we try something out, it might not work, so we try something else, going back to that reflexive approach again. So these are really, the fundamentals, I think, of what links, or rather positions gardening as a creative practice. Now, to the cool bit, this is the bit I really got excited about. So I started thinking about other links between gardening and creative practice, and this is where it comes back to that well-being aspect. And why? Because creative practices are known throughout the land to be good for our well-being. There's a whole arts and culture and well-being organisation been set up. There's an all-parliamentary group set up to deal with us. This is a big thing at the moment. It's quite the zeitgeist. And I think, similarly, as I mentioned before, those organisations within the horticultural sector, like the RHS and so on, they're also pushing this agenda. So there's a marriage here. And it got me thinking about Csikszentmihalyi's model of what creativity is. Now, maybe you've come across flow theory before. I don't know. Has anyone?
No.
Okay. I think, I've mentioned biophilia. We're good with that one. So we know we've got that connection. So I'll just take us to this then. So this is flow theory. For Csikszentmihalyi, the optimal condition of creativity is here, and it's why it's called flow. So you've got really high challenge in the activity that you're undertaking, but also a really high ability to be able to actually undertake that activity. A really high ability to undertake that activity. Now, for me, that's, I think, indubitable. Most of us have experienced this, what's called flow. It's like being in the zone. It's when you're so intently focused on something that you forget time, hunger doesn't come into it, time slips away from you. It's a real thing, and I think most people experience it. Gamers experience it quite often. Athletes experience it. It's a commonly known phenomenon, or experience rather, but it's called flow. The thing that I experienced though, when I was going through my grieving process, and the thing that I spoke to Sam about, and why I think it connects so nicely to this model, It wasn't flow quite, but it was control. Because I was bringing order back into my life through gardening and through collecting. And it made me happier. And I did start to feel more confident about things because I was sorting things out, you know. So for me, this is the really interesting aspect, because it's very rarely spoken about control in this format, because people always go to flow because that's the sort of the optimal state. I'm starting to wonder really whether it is the optimal state, but maybe it is in this particular graph. So for me, as time's gone on, I've realised that what I call menthology, this complete and overwhelming obsession, I don't know what you'd call it, infatuation with mint, it's not just about the collecting and the garden anymore now, it's become more for me. My creative practice now is about sharing, it's about finding out as much as I can about all the different species and undertaking research into horticulture. So it's become really broad now, which is why I call it menthology, because it's not just a creative practice, it's not just gardening, it's even more now for me. Nonetheless, I think there are some definite things that really work as ideas in this whole sort of movement, or whatever you want to call it. We know that gardening is good for our physical and mental well-being, 100%. You know, there's too many articles and pieces of research now that demonstrate that this is the case. It's kind of, I feel really like this, we just need to stop talking about it, take it as read and move on. But unfortunately, I think there are still battles to be fought over this one, so I do keep including it. I don't think there's been a great deal of work done on gardening as a space to reflect. There has been, but I don't think by comparison there's as much. So I do think that's quite interesting. I think it's becoming clearer now that the climate crisis is something that can be mitigated, at least in a small part, by gardening. I purposely do not use the word sustainable development. To me, that's an oxymoron. 2005, there was a paper by a chap called Redcliffe where he states that very fact. The two don't work. It's like saying, you know, progress is different. I know I'm not even going to get into that one actually. Progress as a word is really, really difficult. But I think sustainability is something we can live with. It's about maintaining biodiversity in this case. So it's about maintaining the status quo nearly, or improving it maybe, but not trying to make things bigger, better, developing. That's a different thing. And then finally, this interdisciplinary and cross-curricular thing I think is really interesting, because it seems in the last couple of years at least that there's more and more of that happening. As I mentioned, the BBC and the who was it? Oh, It's Nice That is the company that they teamed up with to link the creative arts, creative practices and gardening together. So really, finally, before we have a big sniffathon and get all the different mints out and have a little explore about what they are and take questions and that kind of thing, this was my real big take home from my experiences and what I've learned and the activities I've been involved with, is that collecting and gardening is about taking control through nurturing. That as an idea, as a phrase, that for me that's it. And that's why I think it does so much good for us in terms of certainly our mental health as well, mental well-being in particular. So, what am I doing next? Still quite the same actually as you would have seen in the autumn. Not developed it too much yet. I've started a cataloguing project, because the really crazy thing about mint is that even though we use it every day, most people, you know, just even if we're just cleaning our teeth, so little is known about it. It's just, you know, there are several species where even on, you know, like on Wikipedia or something like that, there's only a stub. There's very few books about it. There are some articles, but they're so widely disparate in what they agree on. It's a minefield really. I think the exception probably within the Lamaceae family, genus, is sage. There's been some really good research on sage. I think partly because it links to the neurological benefits of the plant. But I just think it's a travesty that we've not looked at mint. I mean, I would say that about mint, but well, for many plants actually, but certainly for mint, when it's so, you know, it's used so much. So that's something I've started doing. I've just got some funding to photograph the whole collection as well. So we've got some wonderful photographers come in to to work with us in August to go through the whole lot and do a botanical sort of record. So hopefully that will be something then that we've got as a species. I started trying to work with crest. I'm not sure how far we've got with that really. We had to put a pause on it. And that's partly because a lot of the mints that I've collected look exactly the same, behave the same, and yet are given slightly different names, and that becomes difficult. And it's a bit of a battle with nurseries and suppliers, because of course they always want to have that edge. So I collect an orange mint. 3 months later, there's a Granada orange mint. Now, if you put them next to each other, and the tangerine mint and the Satsuma mint as well, they actually all look the same. Now, it's really difficult to tell, obviously just visually and through habit. The only real way, I think, is through some sort of genome sequencing project, which, again, I'm hoping to try and kick off, which is why it would be wonderful why to be sort of teamed up with such establishments and institutions as yours as well. In the process of writing a book, that's about halfway through. Got a nice publisher in London lined up. The project extending Mintopia to primary schools has started. I'm really chuffed about this. I gave a talk to the head teachers conference in Cumbria, but it was all the Cheshire schools. That's where Chester's based. It's all the Cheshire schools. And I think we had 23 heads sign up to become Mintopia schools. So the idea of that is that the children will start their own collections. They'll be the plant guardians. They'll look after the plants. It's their job to. But what makes it a bit fun is that I'm allowed to lend plants through DEFRA that's DEFRA permitted. So they're going to trade their plants with one another. So, and then there's a sort of a bit of a league table-y type idea where they get points for how many species they've collected or types they've collected, but even more points for how many they've shared. And so far it's going okay. It's only early days, but it's quite interesting to see how it's going to work out. And then my big dream one day is to hybridize, but I don't know if I'll ever get there. I've not even got a greenhouse. So it's going to be a bit of time, I think, that one. So that's where I'm up to. There's a load of references, and I hope that made some sense. It was quite quick. I think it was all right, though. I was just within 30 minutes, I think. Yeah? Okay. Thank you for having me.